And I'm joined now by Nathalie Tocci, a professor in the School of Advanced International Studies, Europe of Johns Hopkins University. Good to have you on the programme. So yesterday, Tehran announced that it will close the Strait of Hormuz because Washington failed to enforce an end to the fighting in southern Lebanon. Now the US threatens to impose tolls if a peace deal can't be achieved within the agreed 60-day period. Is all that a good start to serious peace negotiations?
Well, clearly, no, it's not a good start. I think that we are still in a situation in which both the United States and Iran have an interest in this Memorandum of Understanding, at least in its first phase, going ahead as planned. But of course, we also know that the MOU in its first article actually includes other countries beyond the United States and Iran, and in particular, it puts the emphasis on a ceasefire on all fronts, including Lebanon. And we know that Israel is, in fact, the prime actor that doesn't have an interest in this MOU going forward. So essentially what we're seeing is a triangulation whereby Israel cannot sabotage the deal directly, given that it cannot attack Iran without the green light from the United States. So it aims to do so indirectly, essentially by preventing a ceasefire from taking hold in Lebanon. Iran knows full well that if the United States wants, it can impose upon Israel to stop the violence in Lebanon, and therefore, in order to pressure the United States, it is now threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz once again. So essentially what you end up having is, through this asymmetric conflict, through this triangulation, each party trying to assert pressure and exert pressure on the other, not necessarily doing so directly, but doing so either through the Strait of Hormuz in the case of Iran or through Lebanon in the case of Israel.
So in this rather muddled scenario there, top-level talks have started in Switzerland. Vice President JD Vance also took part, and he's also already made a statement there. Let's listen to what he had to say.
What the president has asked us to do is turn over a new leaf, to transform our relationship with the people of Iran and to extend an outstretched hand that says to the people of Iran that if your leadership is willing to give up being a driver of regional instability, if they are willing to give up nuclear weapons ambitions for the long term, then the United States is willing to fundamentally transform our relationship with that country.
Now, Nathalie Tocci there, what's really striking to me is that JD Vance was addressing the people of Iran. What do you make of that?
It was actually quite an extraordinary statement. I mean, basically what Vance is putting out there is, in some respects, something not fundamentally dissimilar to what Obama had put on the table. So essentially, turning the leaf in US-Iran relations, provided that Iran actually does put a definitive halt to its nuclear program. So this is kind of fundamentally not that different from the underlying logic of the JCPOA. The question really is, on the one hand, trust has been broken in a very fundamental way. So obviously re-establishing that and embedding and baking it into an agreement is going to be way harder now than it was back in 2015. And secondly, as indeed the experience of the JCPOA teaches us, the JCPOA was essentially in negotiation for 12 years. Right? I mean, the negotiation actually started in 2002, 2003 and culminated in 2015. It is presumably extremely difficult, if not outright impossible, to imagine that anything akin in terms of complexity and depth to the JCPOA is actually going to be negotiated in 60 days. So the question really is, in the next 60 days, is enough going to be done to essentially bolster that Memorandum of Understanding to ensure that the negotiation bull keeps on going without being sabotaged, as we were saying earlier, by those parties that actually want to see a return to war?
Now, of course, there's several parties involved there, and one wonders whether the talks right now are actually about Iran's nuclear program. And we will all remember that Donald Trump insisted Iran must never have a nuclear bomb, and this is basically the key to any deal. But could it also be that those talks have now evolved into something much more broader, such as a negotiation of the entire regional security order?
I mean, I think at the moment, there is going to be obviously the sort of key question of what happens to the nuclear program. And in particular, what happens to the 440 kilo of highly enriched uranium above 70%? What happens to the question of the right to enrichment? And especially something which is actually not talked about very much. How about reinstalling a mechanism of inspections? We know that the Trump administration is not a big fan of multilateralism. And yet, the only actor that can actually play this role is the International Agency for Nuclear Energy. But of course, as you rightly say, I think, the much broader issue to put on the table is, on the one hand, I would say, the relationship between the United States and Iran. The reconstitution of a regional security complex between Iran and countries in the Gulf, but also within the Gulf. There is obviously the main cleavage, which has really come to the fore and, in fact, kind of exploded in the course of this war within the Gulf, and in particular between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And then, of course, none of this is ever really going to see a sort of sustainable, steady state until when we actually, in some shape or form, address the real question at the heart of it all, which is actually the relationship between Iran and Israel. Is this negotiation at some point going to broach the question of a non-aggression pact between these two regional players?
Now, you mentioned the relationship between Iran and Israel, and the ceasefire between Israel and the Iranian-backed militia Hezbollah is very fragile. We've seen that over the last few days. And now the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, said that the Israel military was not prepared to accept any restrictions on its operations in southern Lebanon. You already used the word sabotage. I mean, is that Israel's game plan to sabotage a peace deal between the US and Iran? Is it just defending its interests? I mean, what does Israel get out of it?
Well, I mean, I stand by the word and I would reiterate it. Yes, I absolutely am convinced that Israel is bent, or rather the Israeli government is bent on sabotaging a memorandum of understanding that it has made quite clear that it considers to be terrible, right? So I think that intention is there. Now, that obviously doesn't necessarily mean that, therefore, Israel has no security concerns. Of course, it has security concerns when it comes to Hezbollah and the security of its citizens in northern Israel. And I think a third element that we need to keep in mind is domestic and electoral, right? I mean, Israel is heading to the polls. And Prime Minister Netanyahu knows that he either wins or he's probably going to end up in jail, right? And so Netanyahu also has a very personal interest in ensuring that this war actually continues and resumes. And as I said, the only real way in which they can ensure that the war carries on is through the Lebanese theatre, given that they can't do so directly in Iran. Now, what I also think is extremely interesting, I mean, earlier we were listening to Vance, another really remarkable sort of declaration, set of statements that Vance made recently really goes, at the heart of the US-Israeli relationship, essentially telling Israel, hey, you totally depend on us. Everyone in the world has ended up hating you, given the way in which you're acting. Basically, we are the ones with the cards, to use a very Trumpian expression. And in some respects, of course, in fact, in many respects, Vance is absolutely right. Yeah, the question is whether that potential leverage that the US has on Israel, President Trump is actually willing to exercise it in ways that all previous presidents before him were not willing to do, in order to basically keep Israel at bay, in order to ensure that the this kind of trilateral, very uneasy truce in the region actually persists.
So, in this extremely complex situation there, assuming that these talks produce an agreement, within 60 days. What would success actually look like?
Well, that's the thing. So I think, if we are looking for success in terms of something like the JCPOA, frankly speaking, we're setting the bar so high that I think there's zero chances that we're going to get there. What I do think is possible, very difficult, but it's possible, is to start striking a number, let's call them, of mini deals, yeah? I mean, frankly speaking, the Trump administration doesn't really have the political bandwidth or the competence to negotiate something which is longer than a couple of pages, right? So what we could imagine is a number of mini deals, a mini deal on what happens to the 440 kilos of highly enriched uranium in return for some kind of, sanction relief. What happens, if Iran concedes to a return of IAEA inspectors, what it gets in return. So, I think what we can hope to achieve in 60 days is the bolstering of this phase one, not quite necessarily reaching to a phase two, but perhaps a kind of phase 1.5 that essentially keeps diplomacy going.
All right, so a list full of mini deals, that is something that we may be able to look forward to. Nathalie Tocci, there, professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, Europe. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you.